there, everybody. So we're going to try for a bit of a double feature tonight and see how much I can get done before I need to get to bedtime. So, first of all, I figure we can start off the evening with a chapter or two of Howl's Moving Castle, because I read it once to a small about this time last year, give or take a month or two, and it is a very good story. So, this is Diana Wynne Jones' Howl's Moving Castle. And for the record, both the book and the movie are fantastic. Just differently fantastic. So, Chapter 1, in which Sophie talks to hats. In the land of Ingary, where such things as 7-league boots and cloaks of invisibility really do exist, it is quite a misfortune to be born the eldest of 3. Everyone knows you are the one who will fail first and worst if the 3 of you are sent out to seek your fortune. Sophie Hatter was the eldest of 3 sisters. She was not even the child of a poor woodcutter, which might have given her some chance of success. Her parents were well-to-do and kept a ladies' hat shop in the prosperous town of Market Chipping. True, her own mother had died when Sophie was 2 years old, and her little sister Letty was 1 year old, and their father married his youngest shop assistant, a pretty blonde girl named Fanny. Fanny shortly gave birth to their 3rd sister, Martha. This ought to have made Sophie and Letty into ugly sisters, but in fact, all 3 girls grew up very pretty indeed, though Letty was the one everyone said was the most beautiful. Fanny treated all 3 girls with the same kindness and did not favor Martha in the least. Mr. Hatter was proud of his 3 daughters and sent them all to the best school in town. Sophie was the most studious. She read a great deal and very soon realized how little chance she had of an interesting future. It was a disappointment to her, but she was still happy enough looking after her sisters and grooming Martha to seek her fortune when the time came. Since Fanny was always busy at the shop, Sophie was the one who looked after the younger 2. There was a certain amount of screaming and hair-pulling between those younger 2. Letty was by no means resigned to being the one who, next to Sophie, was bound to be the least successful. "It's not fair," Letty would shout. "Why should Martha have the best chance? Just because she was born the youngest, I shall marry a prince, so there!" To which Martha always retorted that she would end up disgustingly rich without having to marry anybody. Then Sophie would have to drag them apart and mend their clothes. She was very deft with her needle. As time went on, she made clothes for her sisters too. There was one deep rose outfit she made for Letty the May Day before this story really starts, which Fanny said looked as if it had come from the most expensive shop in Kingsbury. About this time, everyone began talking of the Witch of the Waste again. It was said that the witch had threatened the life of the king's daughter, and that the king had commanded his personal magician, Wizard Suleiman, to go into the waste and deal with the witch. And it seemed that the Wizard Suleiman had not only failed to deal with the witch, he had gotten himself killed by her. So, when, a few months later, a tall black castle suddenly appeared on the hills above Market Chipping, blowing clouds of black smoke from its 4 tall, thin turrets, everybody was fairly sure that the witch had moved out of the waste again, and was about to terrorize the country the way she used to 50 years ago. People got very scared indeed. Nobody went out alone, particularly at night. What made it all scarier was the castle did not stay in the same place. Sometimes it was a tall black smudge on the moors to the northwest, other times it reared over the rocks to the east, and sometimes it came right downhill to sit in the heather, only just beyond the last farm to the north. You could see it actually moving sometimes, with smoke pouring out from the turrets in dirty, gray gusts. For a while, everyone was certain that the castle would come right down into the valley before long, and the mayor talked of sending to the king for help. But the castle stayed roving about the hills, and it was learned that it did not belong to the witch, but to the Wizard Howl. Wizard Howl was bad enough. Though he did not seem to want to leave the hills, he was known to amuse himself by collecting young girls and sucking the souls from them. Or, some people said, he ate their hearts. He was an utterly cold-blooded and heartless wizard, and no young girl was safe from him if he caught her on her own. Sophie, Letty, and Martha, along with all of the other girls in market chipping, were warned never to go out alone, which was a great annoyance to them. They wondered what use the wizard Howl found for all the souls he collected. They had other things on their minds before long, however, for Mr. Hatter died suddenly just as Sophie was old enough to leave school for good. It then appeared that Mr. Hatter had been altogether too proud of his daughters. The school fees he'd been paying had left the shop in quite heavy debts. When the funeral was over, Fanny sat down in the parlor in the house next door to the shop and explained the situation. "You'll all have to leave school, I'm afraid," she said. "I've been doing sums back and front and sideways, and the only way I can see to keep the business going and take care of the three of you is to see you all settled in a promising apprenticeship somewhere. It isn't practical to have you all in the shop. I can't afford it. So, this is what I've decided. Letty first." Letty looked up, glowing with health and beauty which even sorrow and black clothes could not hide. "I want to go on learning," she said. "So you shall, love," said Fanny. "I've arranged for you to be apprenticed to Cesare's, the pastry cook in Market Square. They've a name for treating their learners like kings and queens, and you should be very happy there, as well as learning a useful trade. Mrs. Cesare is a good customer and a good friend, and she's agreed to squeeze you in as a favor." Letty laughed in the way that showed she was not at all pleased. "Well, thank you," she said. "Isn't it lucky that I like cooking?" Fanny looked relieved. Letty could be awkwardly strong-minded at times. "Now, Martha," she said, "I know you're full young to go out to work, so I've thought round for something that could give you a long, quiet apprenticeship and go on being useful to you, whatever you decide to do after that. You know my old school friend, Annabel Fairfax?" Martha, who was slender and fair, fixed her big gray eyes on Fanny almost as strong-mindedly as Letty. "You mean the one who talks such a lot?" she said. "Isn't she a witch?" "Yes, with a lovely house and clients all over the Folding Valley," Fanny said eagerly. "She's a good woman, Martha. She'll teach you all she knows and very likely introduce you to grand people she knows in Kingsbury. You will be set up in life when she's done with you." "She is a nice lady," Martha conceded. "All right." Sophie, listening, felt that Fanny had worked everything out just as it should be. Letty, as the second daughter, was never likely to come up to much, so Fanny had put her where she might meet a handsome young apprentice and live happily ever after. Martha, who was bound to strike out and make her fortune, would go and take witchcraft and rich friends to help her. As for Sophie herself, Sophie had no doubt what was coming. It did not surprise her when Fanny said, "Now, Sophie, dear, it seems only right and just that you should inherit the hat shop when I retire, being the oldest as you are, so I've decided to take you on as apprentice myself, to give you a chance to learn the trade. How do you feel about that?" Sophie could hardly say that she simply felt resigned to the hat trade. She thanked Fanny gratefully. "So that's settled, then," Fanny said. The next day, Sophie helped Martha pack her clothes in a box, and the morning after that they all saw her off on the carrier's cart, looking small and upright and nervous. For the way to Upper Folding, where Mrs. Fairfax lived, lay over the hills past Wizard Howl's moving castle. Martha was understandably scared. "Oh, she'll be all right," said Letty. Letty refused all help with the packing. When the carrier's cart was out of sight, Letty crammed all of her possessions into a pillowcase and paid the neighbor's boot boy 6 pence to wheel it down in a wheelbarrow to Cesare's in Market Square. Letty marched behind the wheelbarrow, looking much more cheerful than Sophie expected. Indeed, she had the air of shaking the dust of the hat shop off her feet. The boot boy brought back a scribbled note from Letty saying that she had put her things in the girls' dormitory, and Cesare's seemed great fun. A week later, the carrier brought a letter from Martha to say that Martha had arrived safely, and that Mrs. Fairfax was a great dear and uses honey in everything. She keeps bees. And that was all that Sophie heard of her sisters for quite a while, because she started her own apprenticeship the day that Martha and Letty left. Sophie, of course, knew the hat trade quite well already. Since she was a tiny child, she had run in and out of the big workshed across the yard, where the hats were damped and molded on blocks. Flowers and fruit and other trimmings were made from wax and silk. She knew the people who worked there. Most of them had been there when her father was a boy. She knew Bessie, the only remaining shop assistant. She knew the customers who brought the hat, or who bought the hats, and the man who brought the cart, or who drove the cart which fetched raw straw hats in from the country to be shaped on the wood blocks in the shed. She knew the other suppliers and how you made felt for winter hats. There was not really all that much that Fanny could teach her, except perhaps the best way to get a customer to buy a hat. "Oh, you lead up to the right hat, love," Fanny said. "Show them the ones that don't quite do it first, so they know the difference as soon as they put the right one on." In fact, Sophie did not sell hats very much. After a day or so of observing in the workshed, and another day working round the clothier and the silk merchants with Fanny set her to trimming hats. Sophie sat in a small alcove at the back of the shop, sewing roses to bonnets and veiling to velours, lining all of them with silk and arranging wax fruit and ribbons stylishly on the outsides. She was very good at it. She quite liked doing it, but she felt isolated and a little dull. The workshop people were too old to be much fun, and, besides, they treated her as someone apart who was going to inherit the business some day. Bessie treated her the same way. Bessie's only talk, anyway, was about the farmer she was going to marry the week after May Day. Sophie rather envied Fanny, who could bustle off to bargain with the silk merchant whenever she wanted. The most interesting thing was the talk from the customers. Nobody can buy a hat without gossiping. Sophie sat in her alcove and stitched, and heard that the mayor never would eat green vegetables, and that the Wizard Howl's castle had moved round to the cliffs again. Really, that man, whisper, whisper, whisper. The voices always dropped low when they talked of Wizard Howl, but Sophie gathered that he had caught a girl down the valley last month. "Whew! Opal, you have made one monstrous fart." "Oh, good Lord. I'm sorry, but I have to turn the fan on now." Whew! Oh, stinky puppy. I love you very much, but warn me next time. Sorry if that's loud, but whew, curled my nose hairs. The voices always dropped low when they talked of Wizard Howl, but Sophie gathered that he had caught a girl down the valley last month. "Bluebeard," said the whispers, and then became voices again, to say that Jane Ferrier was a perfect disgrace the way that she did her hair. That was one who would never attract even the Wizard Howl, let alone a respectable man. Then there would be a fleeting, fearful whisper about the Witch of the Waste. Sophie began to feel that the Wizard Howl and the Witch of the Waste should get together. They seemed to be a match made for one another. Someone ought to arrange a match. No, they seemed to be made for one another. Someone ought to arrange a match, she remarked to the hat she was trimming at the moment. By the end of the month, the gossip in the shop was suddenly all about Letty. Cesar's, it seemed, was packed with gentlemen from morning to night, each one buying quantities of cakes and demanding to be served by Letty. She had had 10 proposals of marriage, ranging in quality from the mayor's son to the lad who swept the streets, and she'd refused them all, saying that she was much too young to make up her mind yet. "I call that very sensible of her," Sophie said to a bonnet she was pleating silk into. Fanny was pleased with the news. "I knew she'd be all right," she said happily. It occurred to Sophie that Fanny was glad that Letty was no longer around. "Letty's bad for custom," she told the bonnet, pleating away at the mushroom-colored silk. "She would have made even you look glamorous, you dowdy old thing. Other ladies look at Letty and despair." Sophie talked to hats more and more as the weeks went by. There was no one else much to talk to. Fanny was out bargaining or trying to whip up custom much of the day, and Bessie was busy serving and telling everyone her wedding plans. Sophie got into the habit of putting each hat on its stand as she finished it, where it sat, almost looking like a head without a body, and pausing while she told the hat what the body under it ought to be like. She flattered the hats a bit, because you could flatter customers. "You have a mysterious allure," she told one that was all veiling and hidden twinkles. To a wide creamy hat with roses under the brim, she said, "You are going to marry money." And to a caterpillar green straw hat with a curly green feather, she said, "You are young as a spring leaf." She told pink bonnets that they had dimpled charm, and smart hats trimmed with velvet that they were witty. She told the mushroom-pleated bonnet, "You have a heart of gold, and someone in a high position will see it and fall in love with you." This was because she was sorry for that particular bonnet. It looked so fussy and plain. Jane Ferrier came into the shop the next day and bought it. Her hair did look a little strange, Sophie thought, peeping out of her alcove, as if Jane had wound it up on a row of pokers. It seemed a pity that she had chosen that bonnet, but everyone seemed to be buying hats and bonnets around then. Maybe it was Fanny's sales talk, or maybe it was spring coming on, but the hat trade was definitely picking up. Fanny began to say, a little guiltily, "I think I shouldn't have been in such a hurry to get Martha and Letty placed out. At this rate, we might have managed." There was so much custom as April drew on toward May Day that Sophie had had to put on a demure gray dress to help around the shop too. But such was the demand that she was hard at trimming hats in between customers, and every evening she took them next door to the house, where she worked by lamplight far into the night in order to have hats to sell the next day. Caterpillar green hats like the one the mayor's wife had were much called for, and so were pink bonnets. Then, the week before May Day, someone came in and asked for one of the mushroom pleats, like the one Jane Ferrier had been wearing, when she ran off with the Count of Cataract. That night she sewed. Sophie admitted to herself that her life was rather dull. Instead of talking to the hats, she tried each one on as she finished it, and looked in the mirror. This was a mistake. The staid gray dress did not suit Sophie, particularly when her eyes were red-rimmed with sewing, and, since her hair was a reddish strawish color, neither did caterpillar green nor pink. The one with mushroom pleats simply made her look dreary. "Like an old maid," said Sophie. Not that she wanted to race off with counts like Jane Ferrier, or even fancied half the town offering her marriage like Letty, but she wanted to do something. She's not sure what. That had a bit more interest to it than simply trimming hats. She thought she would find the time next day to go out and talk to Letty, but she didn't go. Either she could not find the time, or she couldn't find the energy, or it seemed a great distance to Market Square, or she remembered that on her own she was very much in danger from the wizard Howl. Anyway, every day it seemed more difficult to go and see her sister. It was very odd. Sophie had always thought that she was nearly as strong-minded as Letty. Now she was finding that there were some things that she could only do when there were no excuses left. "This is absurd," Sophie said. "Market Square is only 2 streets away. If I run—" And she swore to herself that she would go round to Cesari's when the hat shop was closed for May Day. Meanwhile, a new piece of gossip came into the shop. The king had quarreled with his own brother, Prince Justin, it is said, and the prince had gone into exile. Nobody quite knew the reason for the quarrel, but the prince had actually come through Market Chipping in disguise a couple of months back, and nobody had known. The Count of Cataract had been sent by the king to look for the prince, when he happened to meet Jane Ferrier instead. Sophie listened and felt sad. Interesting things did seem to happen, but always to someone else. Still, it would be nice to see Letty. So May Day came. Merrymaking filled the streets from dawn onward. Fanny went out early, but Sophie had a couple of hats to finish first. Sophie sang as she worked. After all, Letty was working too. Cesari's was open till midnight on holidays. "I shall buy one of her cream cakes," Sophie decided. "I haven't had one in ages." She watched people crowding past the window in all kinds of bright clothes, people selling souvenirs, people walking on stilts, and felt really excited. But when she at last put on a gray shawl over her gray dress and went out into the street, Sophie did not feel excited. She felt overwhelmed. There were too many people rushing past, laughing and shouting, far too much noise and jostling. Sophie felt as if the past months of sitting and sewing had turned her into an old woman or a semi-invalid. She gathered her shawl around her and crept along close to the houses, trying to avoid being trodden on by people's best shoes or being jabbed by elbows in trailing silk sleeves. When there came a sudden volley of bangs overhead somewhere, Sophie thought she was going to faint. She looked up and saw the Wizard Howl's castle right down on the hillside above the town, so near it seemed to be sitting on the chimneys. Blue flames were shooting out all four of the castle's turrets, bringing balls of blue fire with them that exploded high in the sky quite horrendously. Wizard Howl seemed to be offended by Mayday, or maybe he was trying to join in his own fashion. Sophie was too terrified to care. She would have gone home, except that she was halfway to Cesari's by then, so she ran. What made me think I wanted life to be interesting, she asked as she ran. I'd be far too scared. It comes of being the eldest of three. When she reached Market Square, it was worse, if possible. Most of the inns were in the square. Crowds of young men swaggered beerily to and fro, trailing cloaks and long sleeves and stamping buckled boots that they would have never dreamt of wearing on a working day, calling loud remarks and accosting girls. The girls strolled past in fine pairs, ready to be accosted. It was perfectly normal for Mayday, but Sophie was scared of that too. And when a young man in a fantastical blue and silver costume spotted Sophie and decided to accost her as well, Sophie shrank to a shop doorway and tried to hide. The young man looked at her in surprise. "Oh, it's all right, you little gray mouse," he said, laughing rather pityingly. "I only wanted to buy you a drink. Don't look so scared." The pitying look made Sophie utterly ashamed. He was such a dashing specimen, too, with a bony, sophisticated face. Really quite old, well into his 20s. And elaborate blonde hair. His sleeves trailed longer than any in the square, all scalloped edges and silver incense. "Oh, no, thank you, if you please, sir," Sophie stammered. I'm on my way to see my sister." "Oh, then by all means do so," laughed this advanced young man. "Who am I to keep a pretty lady from her sister? Would you like me to go with you, since you seem so scared?" He meant it kindly, which made Sophie more ashamed than ever. No, thank you, sir," she gasped and fled away past him. He wore perfume, too. The smell of hyacinths followed her as she ran. What a courtly person, Sophie thought, as she pushed her way in between the little tables outside Cesari's. The tables were packed, inside was packed, and as noisy as the square. Sophie located Letty among the line of assistants at the counter because of the group of evident farmer sons leaning their elbows on it to shout remarks to her. Letty, prettier than ever and perhaps a little thinner, was putting cakes into bags as fast as she could go, giving each bag a deft little twist and looking back under her own elbow with a smile and an answer for each bag that she twisted. There was a great deal of laughter. Sophie had to fight her way through to the counter. Letty saw her, and she looked shaken for a moment. Then her eyes and her smile widened, and she shouted, "Sophie!" Can I talk to you?" Sophie yelled. "Somewhere," she shouted a little helplessly as a large, well-dressed elbow jostled her back from the counter. "Just a moment," Letty screamed back. She turned to the girl next to her and whispered. The girl nodded, grinned, and came to take Letty's place. "You'll have to have me instead," she said to the crowd. "Who's next?" "But I wanted to talk to you, Letty," one of the farmer's sons yelled. "Talk to Carrie," Letty said. "I want to talk to my sister." Nobody really seemed to mind. They jostled Sophie along to the end of the counter, where Letty held up a flap and beckoned and told her not to keep Letty all day. When Sophie had edged through the flap, Letty seized her wrist and dragged her into the back of the shop to a room surrounded by rack upon wooden rack, each one filled with rows of cakes. Letty pulled forward 2 stools. "Sit down," she said. She looked at the nearest rack in an absent-minded way and handed Sophie a cream cake out of it. "You may need this," she said. Sophie sank onto the stool, breathing the rich smell of cake and feeling a little tearful. "Oh, Letty, I'm so glad to see you." "Yes, I'm glad you're sitting down," said Letty. "You see, I'm not Letty. I'm Martha." And Chapter 2 is in which Sophie is compelled to seek her fortune. And considering they're visiting a bakery, I am compelled to eat some of the homemade brownies that I made. Because I'm excited. I baked. Almost not baking carpet. soggy because I tried doing raspberry topping with mixed success. Well, actually, it seems like it dried out enough that it's kind of veggie now. No, you do not get brownies. They are bad for you. I baked. The answer is still no, Brown Eyes. It will make you sick. Alright, so, Chapter 2, in which Sophie is compelled to seek her fortune. What? Sophie stared at the girl on the stool opposite her. She looked just like Letty. She was wearing Letty's second-best blue dress, a wonderful blue that suited her perfectly. She had Letty's dark hair and blue eyes. I'm Martha, said her sister. Who did you catch cutting up Letty's silk drawers? I never told Letty, did you? No, said Sophie, quite stunned. She could see it was Martha now. There was Martha's tilt to Letty's head, and Martha's way of clasping her hands round her knees with her thumbs twiddling. Why? Well, I've been dreading you coming to see me, Martha said, because I knew I'd have to tell you. It's a relief now I have. Promise you won't tell anyone? I know you won't tell anyone, if you promise. You're so honorable. I promise, Sophie said. But why? How? Well, Letty and I arranged it, Martha said, twiddling her thumbs, because Letty wanted to learn witchcraft and I didn't. Letty's got brains and she wants a future where she can use them. Only try telling that to Mother. Mother's too jealous of Letty to even admit she has brains. So he could not believe Fanny was like that, but she let it pass. What about you? Eat your cake, said Martha. It's good. Oh, yes, I can be clever, too. It only took me 2 weeks at Mrs. Fairfax to find the spell we're using. Oh no, the camera's down. I got up at night and read her book secretly, and it was really easy. Then I asked if I could go and visit my family, and Mrs. Fairfax said yes. She's a dear. She thought I was homesick, so I took the spell and I came here, and Letty went back to Mrs. Fairfax pretending to be me. The difficult part was the first week when I didn't know all of the things I was supposed to know. It was awful. But I discovered that people like me. They do, you know, if you like them, and then it was all right. And Mrs. Fairfax hasn't kicked Letty out, so I suppose she managed too. Sophie chomped at the cake. She was not really tasting. But what made you want to do this? Martha rocked on her stool, grinning all over Letty's face, twirling her thumbs in a happy pink whirl. I want to get married and have 10 children. You're not old enough, said Sophie. Not quite. But you can see I've got to start quite soon in order to fit 10 children in. And this way it gives me time to wait and see if the person I want likes me for being me. The spell's going to wear off gradually, and I shall get more and more like myself, you see. Sophie was so astonished that she finished her cake without noticing what kind it had even been. Why 10 children? Because that's how many I want, said Martha. I never knew. Well, it wasn't much good going on about it when you were so busy backing Mother up about me making my fortune, Martha said. You thought Mother meant it. I did too, until Father died. And I saw that she was just trying to get rid of us, putting Letty where she was bound to meet a lot of men and get married off, and sending me as far away as she could. I was so angry, and I thought, why not? And I spoke to Letty, and she was just as angry, and we fixed it up. We're fine now, but we both feel bad about you. You're far too clever and nice to be stuck in that shop for the rest of your life. We talked about it, but we couldn't see what we could do. I'm all right, Sophie protested. It's just a bit dull. All right, Martha exclaimed. Yes, you prove you're all right by not coming near here for months, and then turning up in a frightful gray dress and shawl, looking as if even I scare you. What's Mother been doing to you? Nothing, Sophie said uncomfortably. We've been rather busy. You shouldn't talk about Fanny that way, Martha. She is your mother. Yes, and I'm enough like her to understand her, Martha retorted. That's why she sent me so far away, or tried to. Mother knows that you don't have to be unkind to someone in order to exploit them. She knows how dutiful you are. She knows you have this thing about being a failure because you're only the eldest. She's managed you perfectly and got you slaving away for her. I bet she doesn't even pay you. I'm I'm still an apprentice, Sophie protested. Well, so am I, but I get a wage. The Cesaris know I'm worth it, said Martha. That hat shop is making a mint these days, and it's all because of you. You made that green hat that makes the mayor's wife look like a stunning schoolgirl, didn't you? Caterpillar green. I trimmed it, said Sophie. And the bonnet Jane Ferrier was wearing when she met that nobleman, swept on. You're a genius with hats and clothes, and Mother knows it. You sealed your fate when you made Letty that outfit last May Day. Now you earn the money while she goes off gadding. But she's out doing the buying, Sophie said. Buying? Martha cried. Her thumbs whirled. That takes up half a morning. I've seen her, Sophie, and I've heard the talk. She's off in a hired carriage and new clothes on your earnings, visiting all the mansions down the valley. She's saying that she's going to buy that big place down at Vale End and set up in style. And where are you? Well, Fanny's entitled to some pleasure after all of her hard work bringing us up, Sophie said. I suppose I'll inherit the shop. Oh, what a fate, Martha exclaimed. Listen. But at that moment, two empty cake racks were pulled away at the other end of the room, and an apprentice stuck his head through the back of the rack, through from the back somewhere. I thought I heard your voice, Letty, he said, grinning in the most friendly and flirtatious way. The new baking's just up. Tell him. His head, curly and somewhat floury, disappeared again. Sophie thought that he looked like a nice lad. She longed to ask if he was the one that Martha really liked, but she did not get a chance. Martha sprang up in a hurry, still talking. I must get the girls to carry all of these to the shop. Help me with the end of this one. She dragged out the nearest rack, and Sophie helped her hump it past the door into the roaring busy shop. You must do something about yourself, Sophie, Martha panted as they went. Letty kept saying that she didn't know what would happen to you when we weren't around to give you some self-respect. She was right to be worried. In the shop, Mrs. Cesare seized the rack from both of them in massive arms, yelling instructions, and a line of people rushed away past Martha to fetch more. Sophie yelled goodbye and slipped away in the bustle. It did not seem right to take up more of Martha's time. Besides, she wanted to be alone to think. She ran home. There were fireworks now, going up from the field by the river where the fair was, competing with the blue bangs from Howl's castle. Sophie felt more like an invalid than ever. She thought, and she thought, most of the following week, and all that happened was that she became confused and discontented. Things did not just seem to be the way that she thought they were. She was amazed at Letty and Martha. She had misunderstood them for years. But she could not believe that Fanny was the kind of woman that Martha had said. There was a lot of time for thinking, because Bessie duly left to be married, and Sophie was mostly alone in the shop. Fanny did seem to be out a lot, gadding or not, and trade was slack after May Day. After 3 days, Sophie plucked up the courage to ask Fanny, Shouldn't I be earning a wage? Of course, my love, with all you do, Fanny answered warmly, fixing up on a rose-rimmed hat in front of the shop mirror. We'll see about it as soon as I've done the accounts this evening. Then she went out and did not come back until Sophie had shut the shop and taken that day's hats through the house to trim. Sophie at first felt mean to have listened to Martha, but when Fanny did not mention a wage, either that evening nor any time later that week, Sophie began to think that Martha had been right. Maybe I am being exploited, she told a hat that she was trimming with red silk and a bunch of wax cherries. But someone has to do this, or there will be no hats at all to sell. She finished that hat and started on a stark black and white one, very modish, and a quite new thought came to her. Does it matter if there are no hats to sell? She asked. She looked round at the assembled hats, on stands or waiting in a heap to be trimmed. What good are you all? She asked them. You certainly aren't doing me a scrap of good. and she was within an ace of leaving the house and setting out to seek her fortune, until she remembered that she was the eldest and there was no point. She took up the hat again, sighing. She was still discontented, alone in the shop the next morning, when a very plain young woman customer stormed in, whirling a pleated mushroom bonnet by its ribbons. "Look at this!" the young lady shrieked. "You told me this was the same bonnet that Jane Ferrier was wearing when she met the Count, and you lied. Nothing has happened to me at all." "I'm not surprised," Sophie said before she'd caught up with herself. "If you're fool enough to wear that bonnet with a face like that, you wouldn't have the wit to spot the king himself if he came begging, if he hadn't turned to stone first just at the sight of you." The customer glared. Then she threw the bonnet at Sophie and stormed out of the shop. Sophie carefully crammed the bonnet into the basket, panting rather. The rule was, lose your temper, lose a customer. She'd just proven that rule. It troubled her to realize how very enjoyable it had been. A bait. I am intensely proud of those. They're homemade from scratch. A lovely level of chocolate brownie with a raspberry swirl topping. And they came out kind of gooey the first night, but they've been sitting in the fridge for a day and a half, and they are wonderful now. I'm very pleased with myself. Sophie had no time to recover. There was the sound of wheels and horse hooves, and a carriage darkened the window. The shop bell clanged, and the grandest customer she'd ever seen sailed in with a sable wrap drooping from her elbows and diamonds winking all over her dense black dress. Sophie's eyes went to the lady's wide hat first. Real ostrich plume dyed to reflect the pinks and greens and blues, winking in the diamonds, and yet still look black. It was a wealthy hat. The lady's face was carefully beautiful. The chestnut brown hair made her seem young, but Sophie's eyes took in the young man who followed the lady in, a slightly formless-faced person with reddish hair, quite well dressed but pale and obviously upset. He stared at Sophie with a kind of beseeching horror. He was clearly younger than the lady. Sophie was puzzled. "Miss Hatter?" the lady asked, in a musical but commanding voice. "Yes," said Sophie. The man looked more upset than ever. Perhaps the lady was his mother. "I hear you sell the most heavenly hats," said the lady. "Show me." Sophie did not trust herself to answer her in her present mood, so she went out and got hats. None of them were in the lady's class, but she could feel the man's eyes following her, and that made her uncomfortable. The sooner the lady discovered that the hats were wrong for her, the sooner this odd pair would go. She followed Fanny's advice and got out the wrongest first. The lady began rejecting the hats instantly. "Dimples," she said to the pink bonnet, and "youth" to the caterpillar green one. To the one of twinkles and veils she said, "Mysterious allure, how very obvious, what else have you?" Sophie got out the modish black and white, which was the only hat even remotely likely to interest the lady. The lady looked at it with contempt. "This one doesn't do anything for anybody. You are wasting my time, Miss Hatter." "Only because you came in and asked for hats," Sophie said. "This is only a small shop in a small town, madam. Why did you—" Behind the lady, the man gasped, and seemed to be trying to signal a warning. "Even bother to come in," Sophie finished, wondering what was going on. "Well, I always bother when someone tries to set themselves up against the Witch of the Waste," said the lady. "I've heard of you, Miss Hatter, and I don't care for your competition, nor for your attitude. I came to put a stop to you. There." She spread out her hand in a flinging motion towards Sophie's face. "You mean you're the Witch of the Waste?" Sophie quavered. Her voice seemed to have gone strange with fear and astonishment. "I am," said the lady, "and let that teach you to meddle with things that belong to me." "I don't think I did. There must be some mistake," Sophie croaked. The man was now staring at her in utter horror, though she could not see why. "No mistake, Miss Hatter," said the witch. Come, Gaston! She turned and swept to the shop door, while the man was humbly opening it for her. She turned back to Sophie. By the way, you won't be able to tell anyone you're under a spell, she said. The shop door tolled like a funeral bell as she left. Sophie put her hands to her face, wondering what the man had stared at. She felt soft, leathery wrinkles. She looked at her hands. They were wrinkled too, and skinny, with large veins in the back, and knuckles like knobs. She pulled her gray skirt against her legs and looked down at skinny, decrepit ankles and feet that had made her shoes all knobbly. They were the legs of someone about 90, and they seemed to be real. Sophie got herself to the mirror and found she had to hobble. The face in the mirror was quite calm because it is what she had expected to see. It was the face of a gaunt old woman, withered and brownish, surrounded by wispy white hair. Her own eyes, yellow and watery, stared out at her, looking rather tragic. "Oh, don't worry, you old thing," Sophie said to the face. "You look quite healthy. Besides, this is much more like you really are." She thought about her situation quite calmly. Everything seemed to have gone calm and remote. She was not even particularly angry with the Witch of the Waste. "Well, of course, I shall have to do for her when I get the chance," she told herself. "But meanwhile, if Letty and Martha can stand being one another, I can stand being like this, but I can't stay here. Fanny would have a fit. Let's see, this grey dress is quite suitable, but I shall need my shawl and some food." She hobbled over to the shop door and carefully put up the closed notice. Her joints creaked as she moved. She had to walk bowed and slow, but she was relieved to discover that she was quite a hale old woman. She did not feel weak or ill, just stiff. She hobbled to collect her shawl and wrapped it over her head and shoulders, as old women did. Then she shuffled through the house, where she collected her purse with a few coins in it, and a parcel of bread and cheese. She let herself out of the house, carefully hiding the key in its usual place, and hobbled away down the street, surprised at how calm she still felt. She did wonder if she should say goodbye to Martha, but she did not like the idea of Martha not knowing her. It was best to just go. Sophie decided that she would write to both of her sisters when she got wherever she was going, and she shuffled on, through the field where the fair had been, over the bridge, and out into the country lanes beyond. It was a warm spring day. Sophie discovered that being a crone did not stop her enjoying the sight and smell of May in the hedgerows, though the sight was a little blurred. Her back began to ache, and she hobbled sturdily enough, but she needed a stick. She searched the hedges as she went on for a loose stake of some kind. Evidently her eyes were not as good as they had been. She thought she saw a stick a mile or so on, but when she hauled on it, it proved to be the bottom end of an old scarecrow someone had thrown into the hedge. Sophie heaved the thing upright. It had a withered turnip for a face. Sophie found she had some fellow feeling for it. Instead of pulling it to pieces and taking the stick, she stuck it between two branches of the hedge, so that it stood looming rakishly over the May, with the tattered sleeves on its stick arms fluttering over the hedge. "There," she said. Her cracked old voice surprised her into giving a cracked old cackle of laughter. "Ha! Neither of us are up to much, are we, my friend? Maybe you'll get back on your feet if I leave you where someone can see you. Or you'll get back to your field if I leave you somewhere that people can see you." She set off up the lane again, but a thought struck her and she turned back. "Now, if I wasn't doomed to failure because of my position in the family," she told the Scarecrow, "you could come to life and offer to help me in making my fortune. But I wish you luck anyway." She cackled again as she walked on. Perhaps she was a little mad, but then old women often were. She found a stick an hour or so later when she sat down on the bank to rest and eat her bread and cheese. There were noises in the hedge behind her, little strangled squeakings, followed by heavings that shook many petals off the hedge. Sophie crawled on her bony knees to peer past leaves and flowers and thorns into the inside of the hedge and discovered a thin, gray dog there. It was hopelessly trapped by a stout stick, which had somehow got twisted into a rope that was tied round its neck. The stick had wedged itself between two branches of the hedge so that the dog could barely move. It rolled its eyes wildly at Sophie's peering face. As a girl, Sophie was scared of all dogs. Even as an old woman, she was quite alarmed by the two rows of white fangs in the creature's open jaws. But, she said to herself, the way I am now, it's scarcely worth worrying about. And she felt in her sewing pocket for her scissors. Yes, some people, even brave story heroes named Sophie, are sometimes scared of dog. She reached into the hedge with the scissors and sawed away at the rope around the dog's neck. And this is how we know that the author is perhaps not a seamstress, because she is doing this with her fabric scissors. The dog was very wild. It flinched away from her and growled, but Sophie bravely sawed on. You'll starve or throttle to death, my friend, she told the dog in her cracked old lady voice, unless you let me cut you loose. In fact, I think someone has tried to throttle you already, and maybe that accounts for your wildness. The rope had been tied quite tightly around the dog's neck, and the stick had been twisted viciously into it. It took a lot of sawing before the rope parted and the dog was able to drag itself out from under the stick. Would you like some bread and cheese? Sophie asked it then. But the dog just growled at her, forced its way out through the opposite side of the hedge, and slunk away. And this is how we know that the author perhaps does not know dogs, because a dog rejecting cheese. Who ever thought? There's gratitude for you, Sophie said, rubbing her prickled arms. But you left me a gift in spite of yourself. She pulled the stick that had trapped the dog out of the hedge, and found it was a proper walking stick, well trimmed and tipped with iron. Sophie finished her bread and her cheese and set off walking again. The lane became steeper and steeper, and she found the stick a great help. It was something to talk to. It was also something to talk to. Sophie thumped up along with a will, chatting to her stick. After all, old people often talk to themselves. There's 2 encounters, she said, and not a scrap of magical gratitude from either. Still, you're a good stick, and I'm not grumbling, but I'm surely due to have a 3rd encounter, magical or not. In fact, I insist on one. I wonder what it will be. Hello, sweet baby. Are you trying to say that it is bedtime? It's only 9 o'clock. It is not nearly pumpkin time. But, Dad, I love you so. You should come to bed. I love you, puppy. The 3rd encounter came towards the end of the afternoon when Sophie had worked her way quite high into the hills. A countryman came whistling down the lane towards her. A shepherd, Sophie thought, going home after seeing to his sheep. He was a well-set-up young fellow of 40 or so. Oh, gracious, Sophie said to herself. This morning I'd have seen him as an old man. How's one's point of view does alter? When the shepherd saw Sophie mumbling to herself, he moved rather carefully over to the other side of the lane and called out with great heartiness, Good evening to you, mother. Where are you off to? Mother, said Sophie, I'm not your mother, young man. A manner of speaking, the shepherd said, edging along past the opposite hedge. I was only meaning a polite inquiry, seeing you walking down into the hills at the end of the day, and you won't get into the upper folding before nightfall, will you? Sophie hadn't considered this. She stood in the road and thought about it. Well, it doesn't matter, really, she said half to herself. You can't be fussy when you're off seeking your fortune. Can't you indeed, mother? Said the shepherd. He had now edged himself downhill of Sophie, and seemed to feel better for it. Then I wish you good luck, mother, provided your fortune don't have nothing to do with charming folks' cattle. And he took off down the road in great strides, almost running, but not quite. Sophie stared after him indignantly. He thought I was a witch, she said to her stick. She had half a mind to scare the shepherd by shouting nasty things after him, but that seemed a little unkind. She plugged on uphill, mumbling. Shortly, the hedges gave way to bare banks, and the land beyond became heathery upland, with a lot of steepness beyond that, covered in yellow, rattling grass. Sophie kept grimly on. By now her knobbly old feet ached, her back and her knees. She became too tired to mumble and simply plugged on, panting, until the sun was quite low, and all at once it became quite clear to Sophie that she could not walk a step further. She collapsed onto a stone by the wayside, wondering what she could do now. "The only fortune I can think of is a comfortable chair," she gasped. The stone proved to be on a sort of headland, which gave Sophie a magnificent view of the way she'd come. There was most of the valley spread out beneath her in the setting sun, all fields and walls and hedges, the windings of the river, and the fine mansions of rich people, glowing out from clumps of trees, right down to blue mountains in the far distance. Just below her was Market Chipping. Sophie could look down into its well-known streets. There was Market Square and Cesari's. She could have tossed a stone down the chimney pots of the house next to the hat shop. "How near it still is," Sophie told her stick in dismay. "All that walking just to get up above my own rooftop." It got cold on the stone and the sun went down. An unpleasant wind blew whichever way Sophie turned to avoid it. Now it no longer seemed so unimportant that she would be out of the hills during the night. She found herself thinking more and more of a comfortable chair and a fireside, and also of darkness and wild animals. But if she went back to Market Chipping, it would be the middle of night before she got there. She might just as well go on. She sighed and stood up, creaking. It was awful. She ached all over. "I never realized before what old people have to put up with," she panted as she labored uphill. "Still, I don't think wolves will eat me. I must be far too dry and rough. Well, that one's a comfort." Night was coming down fast now, and the heathery uplands were blue-gray. The wind was sharper. Sophie's panting and the creaking of her limbs were so loud in her ears that it took her a while to notice that some of the grinding and puffing was not coming from herself at all. She looked up blurrily. Wizard Howl's castle was rumbling and bumping towards her across the moorland. Black smoke was blowing up in clouds from behind its black battlements. It looked tall and thin and heavy and ugly and very sinister indeed. Sophie leaned on her stick and watched it. She was not particularly frightened. She wondered how it moved, but the main thing in her mind was all that smoke must mean a very large fireside somewhere inside those tall black walls. "Well, why not?" she said to her stick. "Wizard Howl is not likely to want my soul for his collection. He only takes young girls." She raised her stick and waved it imperiously at the castle. "Stop!" she shrieked. The castle obediently came to a rumbling, grinding halt about 50 feet uphill from her. Sophie felt rather gratified as she hobbled towards it. "Yes, O best beloved, light of my light, brown of my eyes, and wag of my butt. Is it bedtime already? Already it is bedtime? So sad, though. So sad. She is so sad. Look at how sad she is. So overcome and sad. So sad. Oh. Well then, at least let me tell them good night, okay? Because I love you very much. Okay, we'll go to bed. You little goober. I love you. Yeah? 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 Is it bedtime? Hmm? Ha 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 ha. I kiss your head. Nothing you can do about it. Alright, well, if sweethearted little puppy says that it is bedtime, then I guess it has to be bedtime, which means that I will only do a single showing tonight. Excuse me. So I suppose that means that we're going to be alternating nights between Howl and Neverwhere. So, yes, dearest? You're not getting a brownie. but I love you. So, she is so pathetic. Get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And remember that if people can hate without reason, then I can love you for absolutely no reason. So, I love you very much, and sleep well.